Box joints, or in this case, finger joints, have been around for a very long time. But if you're a beginner, they can seem very intimidating. They definitely were when I started out. So today we're going to put together a very simple jig that'll allow you to build these box joints really quick and really easily. Let's do this. Our first step is to make sure we have a table saw sled, one that goes back and forth really nicely in our table saw. If by chance you don't have one, I built this one in a previous video. It is directed specifically towards beginners. I'll put a link to it in the description and somewhere right up in here. Now if you have an old sled, or like in my case, I use this one a lot, we need to make sure there's not any excess movement in it. So, I'm not sure if you can hear that. There's a slight bit of movement back and forth in the runners. I've used this one so much it is starting to wear itself out. But if you have anything like this that is making noise or it's not fully square to your runners, you need to rebuild it, or at least make a new one. So in my case, I built a secondary sled that'll be used specifically for finger joints. It's a real simple. I used some MDF and some thin plywood to put it together, and this should work well. At this point, some of you might be asking, isn't it possible just to attach a piece of wood to your miter gauge and use that as is? Possible, yes. Recommended, no. And here are two reasons. First off, making sure that the gauge on the back of here is exactly 90 degrees to the blade can sometimes be a challenge, especially if you ever move this around. And number two, anytime it's in its slot, usually there's a little bit of movement with a miter gauge. And that right there can be a problem. Next up, grab a piece of scrap wood, or in this case MDF, that's about a 1/2 inch thick. This will allow you to do boxes that are 1/2 inch walls or thicker. Now you want this scrap to be about the same size as the back of your sled. It does not have to be exact. If it's a little taller, a little shorter, a little thinner, a little wider, it's okay. The main thing is just that it is close. Then take your sled, put it into its slots, take the scrap piece of wood, put it in place and clamp it down. Looking at the bottom of our scrap piece of wood, we want to make sure that it is flush against the top of our sled. If for some reason it's not, recut that and make sure it is. Now before I go any further, I do have to give you a word of caution. If you're using just a standard table saw blade, in most cases it cuts in an alternating fashion. In other words, one blade cuts in this direction, and the next one cuts like this, and so on and so forth, thus leaving a little piece of wood kind of jolted down like that at the very top of your cut. Now in most cases when you're cutting wood, this is not a problem, but when you're trying to cut out box joints, that little tab can look a little bit weird. And to solve that problem, they actually make specialty blades with flat tops, thus eliminating that tab at the top. But since you're a beginner, I don't recommend getting one of these real quick. I actually recommend using the current blade you currently have. Go out there, make as many of these finger joints as you can until you feel a lot more comfortable making it. If you feel like you can go out and you can make them really easily, then go out and invest in a nicer blade so you can make them almost perfect. Now that we know that our sled and our scrap piece of wood is going to work well together, we want to unclamp it and just lay it up alongside the blade. And then we want to adjust the blade so that it is barely, and I mean just barely, taller than the height of our wood. This is 1/2 inch, so this will just be barely above that. And once you get that adjusted, you can take the scrap, put it back in place, and clamp it down one more time. And it's finally time to make our first cut into our scrap. Once again, we have to take this scrap piece of wood off, so unclamp it. And then we need to find a piece of wood that'll fit in this slot. And the best piece would be a hardwood. This happens to be walnut, but maple or anything else that is a hard wood would work best for this setup. And we want our hardwood here to be the exact height and width as our little notch, so this will take a little bit of work to get it to that size. Please keep in mind that the safest way to cut out a strip like this is to actually have the thickest part of the wood against the fence and the thinnest part facing out. But sometimes that can be really hard to measure. So I'm doing it in an opposite fashion, which is not the safest way to do it, but it does work as long as you have some type of a stopper to help minimize any kickback. Now let's give this a test fit. Oh man, that is almost perfect. It's just barely snug, and that's exactly what we want. There is a chance you may have to recut this a little bit thinner or a little bit wider to get it fit, but you want this to fit just snug in your cut, just like that. Now looking at our newly created strip, we want to measure the height here, and if you look, it is a little on the tall side, so I'm going to cut down one of these sides. And you want to get it as flush as possible. This may not be perfect, but it'll work. And then we want to slide our piece all the way so that it's about flush on the back. And then I'm going to trim it at about 1 inch sticking out. It's finally time to glue this piece in place. I'm just going to use some CA glue to make this quick. But if you don't have CA glue, some wood glue will work. You just have to give it some extra time to dry. Here's a little tip when you're gluing that in place. To keep your wood from moving around, just put a clamp on the end and that should hold it pretty still. Little accelerator to make it quicker. It's now time to make our second notch in our board, and there's actually 2 ways to do it. The first option is to take the strip that we had cut off, and we can align it to the piece that we glued in place there. And you take a really sharp pencil or a knife or a scribe, and you want to make a mark along that edge there to know exactly where it lines up to. Then you want to take that pencil mark and you want to align it right along your cut here where your blade has cut into your sled, so you know exactly where it's going to cut. And then just take your strip and remeasure it. Now mine is not exactly where it should be, and sometimes it happens with this method, so let me show you method number 2. For the second method, we're again going to use our little strip that we had cut out, and we want to get our blade as close to the center of our board here as possible, so really close like that. Take your strip, align it along the edge of the blade here, and then just gently slide your piece over until everything gets in alignment like it's supposed to be. You don't want to push on the blade, you just want it to be barely touching it, and that should do right there. Now it's time to clamp this whole thing down. Then we need to remove that strip and make our second cut. Now we need a couple test pieces so that we can cut everything out and make sure it fits together just right. But before we make these cuts, we always want to mark the top. Just a little line going across, and that way we know that these are the top of the pieces so that the alignment will work together later. And as we did once before, we want to take the piece of wood and put it against the blade and make sure it is just a hair above it. Now remember those marks? We need to make sure those marks, whenever we're making cuts, are facing towards the blade. In other words, if it's on this side of the blade, it needs to be facing that way. And if it's on this side of the blade, it'll be facing that way. Otherwise, when you go to do your alignment later, it could be way off. Then we want to take our board and we want to gently bump it up against the little key that we have here. We're then going to make our first cut, and then we'll lift it up, place that new cut over the key, set it back down, make a second cut, a third cut, a fourth cut, and so on. Once we reach that last cut, we're now going to take our piece and flip it around. Remember, the mark needs to be facing the blade. We're going to put it right back over that first slot right there. Then we're going to take our second piece. Again, mark needs to be facing towards the blade. We're going to put those two together. And then I'm going to make that first cut, remove this piece, move it all the way over, make a second cut, and so on and so forth, just like we did the first one. Now let's see how well these go together. Remember, we mark the tops, so in theory I should be able to just leave it on this table and they should slide together. Let's give this a shot. Alright, that may be a little bit on the snug side, but they fit together really well. Once you do your test joint, if by chance it is too loose, you need to move your pin away from the blade, and I mean just ever so slightly. If by chance it is too tight, you need to move your pin towards the blade just ever so slightly. And if you do have to adjust that pin for your joint, just remember, don't move it more than about the thickness of a piece of paper, because these are real sensitive. And once you've figured out all of the joints and you get a little practice in, you can make a really cool looking box joint for all your boxes. Couple things to remember when you're making these joints. First off, it's always better to have the fingers a little bit longer than the thickness of the board. It's better to have them stick out just a little bit and you can sand them off. Because if they're too short and they're not sticking all the way to the ends, then you have to sand the entire project and it can be a very big pain. So try and get them a little bit longer always. Also, if you can have corresponding colors or opposite colors, in other words, a dark and a light wood, they stand out so much more than having the same type wood all the way around. You can do that and it still looks good, but they just stand out a little bit better with different colors. Now that you can make this simple jig, I hope your future projects are awesome and you can get out in your shop and have fun building.